right, hello. Welcome to my concluding discussion on clearing the plains, disease, politics of starvation, and the loss of Aboriginal life by James Datchuk. I've been reading this with Sean the Book Maniac, and in this video I'm going to talk about the conclusion chapter of this nonfiction book. Which has, as Daschuk himself says, is all about the ecological, economic, and political forces that shaped medical histories, to say the least, in Western Canada. It's the origins of the health inequity between native peoples in Western Canada and mainstream Canadians. And he divides it into, and you've seen this in the book, into two distinct phases. The first phase is the introduction of acute contagious disease into from the old world to the new world. This he characterizes as it's a result of the extension of the global economic system to Western Canada, and I mean, the rest of North America, but specifically what he's focused on. It's trade. It starts off as trade between the old world and the new world, and that basically he's shown throughout the book that every time there's a supply line, every time there's movement up it, it brings with it disease. Every time you hear about, it's like, oh great, they've got steamships. Oh great, they've got the railway. That, from reading this book, you know that each time that happens, that just means more disease vectors brought in to the native communities, causing massive disruption and death in the native communities. By the time we get to 1880, the peoples that the Canadian government forms the treaties with are radically different than what they were pre-contact. Gives example of the and how it affected it's not a monolithic thing. It's like how it affected different communities, different outcomes of the disease. Radically changed what the native communities were, how they were constituted, became constituted. It gives example of the Anishinaabe, were they're amongst the first peoples to actually have contact with the Europeans coming in, and thus have they actually they survive better on the disease. They build up more resistance, versus something like the Assiniboine, who were actually kind of the dominant plains natives, and were extremely successful, lived in fairly dense family units, which made them far more prey to disease, and have indeed, by the end of all this, are reduced to like a handful of reserves across the plains. So it becomes the native populations end up, because basically whole tribes just die off, and the survivors just sort of slowly combine together, that there's a reconstitution of the population. They're adapting to the new marketplace, this new economic thing of the fur trade, the bison becoming much more monoculture, and like we're basically just hunting bison, versus a much more kind of spaced out, much more we do a bit of this hunting, we do a bit of that hunting. It became, no, it's just bison focused, where this is, and also the introduction of stuff like the horse. So you get this contributes to what they call the ethnogenesis of the Plains Cree, basically the creation of a different type, like, a different type of a native population that would have been recognizable pre-contact. This became the dominant force for the next century. So that these First Nations who entered into treaties were inheritors of the plains, rather than the inhabitants since kind of prehistoric times. So that's the first phase. Massive die-off of these populations, a reconstitution, a readjustment of their entire cultural thing create like what, the kind of the cliche native like on the horse hunting bison uh, is is a result of all the disease and all the interaction with the Europeans coming in, the introduction of the horse, the market demands. This is it's their adaptation to what's happened to them. So that's phase one. The second part of this book, the one that's this was the one that uh, really explodes a lot of Canadian myths about itself, was the relationship between First Nations and the newly formed Canada, the Dominion of Canada, but it's Canada. And this is where the government of Canada is interested in, treaties. This is the legal requirement for them to settle the West for development. They need to enter into agreements with the peoples who are already there to be able to then legally settle these areas, like minimum of fuss and muss. For the First Nations people, they're seeing this is going to be a bridge to a future without the bison. They can see it coming. They can see that the bison are going to die and that they need to change. They are the first ones. They're not like, we're holding on to the old ways. It's like, no, we can see it coming. It's the freight train. And we need to get out of the way. We need to change how we are. So that they sought, starting off with like a safety net, which had existed already under the fur trade, where like the Hudson Bay Company had actually provided with like, okay, you're going to be our suppliers and all that. We'll provide you with credit. We'll provide you with health care. They wanted that relationship to continue with the Canadian government. They also wanted, they didn't just want this, and this isn't charity. This is like a social safety net. They wanted an assistance to convert to agriculture. They wanted to be a part of this new economy. They knew the settlers were coming. This was going to become an agricultural economy, and they wanted to be a part of that economy. They wanted to be a productive, thriving, healthy part of that economy. And then finally, a lot of these tribal chiefs also wanted medical aid and famine relief, because they could see that there's going to be a transition point here. And even if they did farmers at this point, there would be drought. They would need famine relief, white settlers, and hopefully all the thriving native peoples who would also be doing agriculture if the Canadian government didn't enter into this in complete bad faith. 2 years later, all the bison were gone. That was the end of a way of life that had been, to one form or another, had persisted for 100,000 years on this continent. And with it, the Indigenous people lost their independence and their power. And with the Canadian government had accepted, with these entering into these treaties, Jastrzak says, had accepted that they needed to do famine relief, and they took legal responsibility for the food crisis. Now, to be fair to the Canadian government, at the beginning of this, they did not have the people or infrastructure to meet the demands for food. They were scrambling. They were, it's like, even with the best intentions, it was going to be really rocky here, because I think the bison going just happened way quicker than anyone expected. However, the government's priorities going forward were not, especially under the Conservative government of John A. Macdonald, were not with helping the Indigenous people. They were focused on the national policy, which in Canada was John A. Macdonald's big thing, which got him reelected after a corruption scandal, because you've got to have a corruption scandal at the start of Canadian government. Continuity throughout. We're seeing on shitty continuity throughout this entire story of Canada, is that he came in on the national policy, which is this policy of, we're going to build a railway across Canada. It's going to unite Canada, and it's also going to be what we're going to use to carry settlers across Canada to settle Canada. to build this great country. But so they were only in that, but that's what the focus of the conservative government. And when it came to food relief, they were like, oh, you're these powerless people who are dependent on us for food. Great, we are going to use the food. This is the politics of starvation. We're going to use the food relief to control the indigenous population, to move them where we want, to punish anybody who rebels against us. And at the same time, they also, going into the corruption, there was one main supplier, an American supplier, for the most of the food, because that basically it was the Canadian water routes were just crappy for getting food across Canada. So they turned to an American company, I.G. Baker Company, which was using the Missouri, where you could get food much deeper into the thing and then up into Canada. But I.G. Baker took this position of power to took advantage of it to supply inferior and spoiled goods to the native populations, often with the complicity of the government officials. And Dasychuk in this book says that this includes the Canadian chief, who's like the highest Canadian chief in the West, Edgar Dewdney. And he uses the words, almost certainly was on the Baker payroll, which almost certainly is one of those phrases that I don't want to get too hung up on this, because I think it seems to be uncontroversial, but that I.G. Baker was supplying the shittiest stuff that they could, oftentimes with Indian agents, signing for signing for the same load twice, so obviously lining their pockets. But uses the weasel words, I call them weasel words, it was almost certainly on the Baker's payroll. I don't know if within this book he provides actual direct proof that particular charge, but there is enough other stuff. But it was one of those things that little stuck out to me, of almost certainly was on the Baker's payroll probably means almost certainly, not completely certainly, if you know what I mean. But regardless, so yes, continued corruption on the corporate level, corruption on the governmental level, but also the government had policies such as the work for pay policy, because we don't want to provide the beggar, lazy natives population with food, because if we did, then they won't work. So we will make them work for their food. Racist asshole assumptions. And also food was withheld to reduce expenditures, because the conservative government, while you think they're completely shitty, it's like the opposing liberal side was also shouting, it's like, why are you spending so much money on these native people? You should be cutting costs and stuff like that, because it was an expensive thing that they had entered into. But they were also settling tons of people on this land, selling this land. So it's not like, and to consider them beggars is to be like, is just like, you entered into an agreement with these people. They've ceded their land. They ceded land to you. You fiscally owe them for this. This is not begging. This is, yeah. So what happens is they, at a certain point, they've actually got food there, but the food is rotting in the storehouses, while people with malnutrition are dying of TB and other diseases. You keep these people at a starvation level, and then even if they don't quite starve, they're at such a weakened level that they're dying at such high numbers from disease, and also at the same time, they are in this new system of the reserves of the Department of Indian Affairs, being able to basically controls life or death, whether you get food or not. They're abusing the officials on the ground a lot of officials are abusing their powers, and often that abuse is sexual abuse by the officials who control the food. And besides that, others just simply, other Native women turn to prostitution, basically as the only way that they're going to actually be able to feed their families. Dasychuk in this book says that the levels of sexually transmitted disease in the Department of Indian officials, that was shockingly high. It's like they were. So I wonder why that is. And indeed, when there's a rebellion in 1885, many of the officials that are actually specifically targeted for retribution are the ones who have been implicated in physical and sexual abuse. And so, as we go along, I've just said in chapter 9 that the response to all of this, to the rebellion, worsened the past system.